attack rolls in Dungeons and Dragons are lame. There, I said it, and you might know what I'm talking about here, because if you roll a 27 to hit, nobody cares. Because if the armor class is 15 and you rolled a 16, you hit, and if you rolled a 27, you still hit the same way. So attack rolls are either a hit or a miss, and unless you get a natural 20, then of course that's cool. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. So I think there's a big missed opportunity of a cool, hype, awesome moment of a high attack roll in Dungeons and Dragons that is just a missed opportunity. And then follow it up with, what if you have a really high attack roll that nobody really cares about because you hit and that's all that anyone cares about at the end of the day, and then you roll for damage and you get a 1 on that D12. So that high attack roll moment that wasn't very exciting, it now leads to a bad, not exciting, feel bad moment of rolling low for damage. And just like there's a ton of house rules out there to help crits not feel so bad, I think there's a method and a solution here to have attack rolls not feel so bad. So if you haven't heard about it already, I am launching my own tabletop roleplay game system called DC20 RPG. That's the code name so far. I've done a few videos on this system already that I'll have linked down in the description. And if you want to help support this project and help take it to the next level to become a fully released TTRPG for everybody, then you can check out the link to my Patreon down in the description as well. That gives full access to early releases and all this other kind of stuff revolving around DC20 RPG. I just went to GaryCon and did a whole bunch of playtests, gave away some free merch and stuff, and the playtest went phenomenal, and I'm going to be talking all about that over on my Patreon, talking about how it all went down. But now let's get into the solution for these attack rolls, because in DC20 RPG, your attack roll is your damage, which actually leads to a lot of other cool benefits that we're going to dive into as well. So let's say that a target has an armor class of 15. So if you roll a 14, anything lower than that 15, 10, 14, whatever, that's a miss, obviously. But what if you roll a 15 to hit? That means you hit and you deal your damage of whatever weapon it is you're wielding, whatever spell it is you're casting, etc. So let's just say you're using a short sword, and for the sake of this example, it's 2 damage. So if you roll a 15, that's 2 damage. 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, that's all 2 damage. But at 20, if you make an attack roll for 20, which exceeds the armor class by 5, you now deal an extra point of damage. And every 5 you exceed the armor class by, you deal an additional bonus point of damage. So yes, 15 is 2 damage, all the way up to 19, then 20 is 3 damage, 25, 30, etc. And we will talk about critical hits here in a second, but this is a really dynamic system of this by 5 increment that's present throughout the entire game. For certain DCs in the game, if you exceed them by 5, something extra cool happens. And another example is if you take the shove action per se, and it's a contest of athletics versus athletics or acrobatics, just like usual. You take the shove action, if you win, you push them back 1 space, but every 5 you beat them by pushes back an additional 1 space. So if you beat them by a whole bunch, you could shove them back really far. And bringing it back to attack rolls, if you do roll that 27 to hit, it actually matters. So when you roll that dice at the table and you roll a 19 or an 18 or something really high and you add all your numbers to it and it's a really high attack roll, it actually matters, and there's a cool moment at the table of like, oh dang, and you get more damage. And how damage works is every single weapon in the game deals a certain base amount of damage. 2-handers dealing 4 damage, 1-handers dealing 2, and a wide variety there in between. And spells have a base damage as well. And the cool part is this whole system applies to spells as well. So if you're shooting that fire bolt, you make an attack roll, it also adds damage the harder you hit. And everything we've talked about up to this point is all base damage, but then there's certain class features, certain talents you get in the game that let you be able to boost that damage as well. Paladins doing a divine smite adds extra damage. A rogue sneak attack, a barbarian's rage, all add extra damage. And there's certain resource pools that you can pour more into. Spellcasters casting a spell can pump more mana, because this system in DC20 uses the mana system instead of spell slots. So mana, you can pump more mana into your spells to deal more damage. And if you've seen my other videos about the 4 action point system in DC20, you can also spend more action points to really hone in an attack and amp up its damage. But what about rolling for damage? Everybody loves to roll for damage, or do they? Time out. Speaking of rolling for damage, we have a sponsor of this video. This is the Yggdrasil dice set from the new Kickstarter that just launched at Ember Forge. And my God, is it the sickest looking metal dice I've ever seen. Not only are these elegant and gorgeous, they are very readable too. As soon as they hit the table, oh man. And we all know how deadly D4s are, but look at this one. Oh baby, watch out. Ember Forge just launched their new Kickstarter, Ember Dice, and they have some of the craziest looking metal dice you've ever seen. The Yggdrasil set is my personal favorite, and man, oh man, it is my favorite set of metal dice. The Atlantean set looks like it came straight out of some dwarven ruins. So check out their Kickstarter right now while you can and pick up one of these sets of the very impressive dice you can show off to your friends. And a big thank you to Ember Dice for sponsoring this video. Okay, now back to rolling for damage. Yes, in DC20 RPG, you do not roll for damage. And I know that that's that's going to upset some people, and people are going to be like, oh, but I love rolling for damage. And I would challenge you, listen to what I have to say, take a step back and really evaluate if you do or not. Because there's two massive benefits here that I think you might not be taking into consideration because maybe you're just so used to rolling for damage. Here we go. One is rolling for damage takes time. It takes almost twice the amount of time because you have to roll to see if you hit, and then there's some sort of like, oh, it hits, and then talking about if it hit or not, and then you roll for damage, and then you have to get that dice and roll that dice and more math. So in DC20, it is going to speed up combat because you don't have to stop and roll for damage each time. When you hit, you actually add in whatever your weapon damage was, plus whatever else you did to it to help boost it, plus all the type of class stuff, and you know pretty quickly what you got. And now the second part is I want to challenge the premise of that it is fun to roll for damage, because you're also not taking into consideration all the times where it is not fun to roll for damage. All those times where you roll a 1 or a 2 and something's supposed to be a big hit and you only roll a 1 on your damage. It's easy to overlook those in the big picture when you're thinking about rolling for damage. You're probably mainly thinking about those times where you have all these dice and you roll all these dice. So from here on forward, when you're playing your other TTRPGs, Dungeons and Dragons, whatever, look for those moments when you have that bad roll and you're like, ah, man, that does kind of suck. And I would also challenge on the high end where you gather up all those dice and that paladin or rogue with that divine smite, sneak attack, crit, rolling all those dice. I don't think it's as good as some people think. Because let me run you through two scenarios here and then you can make your decision on if you agree with me or not. In the D&D scenario where a paladin divine smite crits, you roll a natural 20, you say you're going to divine smite and stuff, and now there's a phase, there's some phases that go through here. That player now has to gather up all the D8s and make sure you calculate and do all the math of how many you're actually grabbing, usually needing to grab some other D8s from other people as well, and then they finally have enough of the D6s and D8s or whatever they have to be able to roll their damage, and that phase is completed, and then they have to now roll all of those dice, and now they all hit the table, and then you have to start adding them up and do a whole bunch of mental math. What's everybody else doing right now? Just sitting around, and maybe the dungeon master wants to keep the pace going in this high intensity thing, because there's that really, whoa, big moment at the table, yeah, there's a big crit, and that is an exciting moment. I'm not denying that, but then it's followed by collecting the dice and rolling the dice and now adding up the dice, and the dungeon master might like keep things going and go on to the next person, like, all right, you add up your numbers and let's keep things going, let's keep the pace going. And then now, but that also feels bad because you just left that person's crit and now they're adding up dice together by themselves. So maybe you want to stay focused on the player that just crit, and now everybody's watching them do math, which is not exciting at all. They're just adding up numbers, and then finally comes to some big number. Let's say it's like 42 or some big number, whatever it is. Oh, wow, 42 damage. Dang, that's crazy. Okay, and then there's, I guess, another cool moment from them saying some big number. Sure. And then the dungeon master writes it down, and then you keep going. Let's go ahead and compare that to the DC20 version, which I think, stay with me, I think would be a better version. The paladin makes an attack roll, they get a critical hit, which again, we'll talk about critical hits in a second. Oh my gosh, that's crazy. There's the same exact hype moment at the table of, oh wow, that's awesome. Now in DC20, you know what the base damage of your weapon is. You're gonna divine smite, okay, cool, let's pump that in there. You add up all the extra damage from how many by fives you've hit it, oh my gosh, and then you say some huge number. Now in DC20, the damage numbers are about a third or a fourth or so less than D&D because all the numbers are kind of scaled down, which also, side note, helps math things, and instead of creatures having hundreds of hit points that you have to minus 20s and 30s and all that kind of stuff from, creatures have much less health and you make smaller adjustments and it's easier math wise. But anyway, the paladin said some large number and you're like, oh dang, that's awesome. But there was no dice collection phase. There was no rolling those dice and there was no adding them up. You had a big hit, everybody's hyped up, you added up the numbers of what that was very quickly, you said the number and the story keeps going. And speaking of critical hits, how critical hits work in DC20 is a natural 20 is just a straight up +2 on top of everything, even after all the extra stuff is done. So what I mean by that, you roll a D20, you add your attack roll and you see, and you compare it to the armor class. Because again, if the creature's armor class is a 15 or whatever versus an armor class of a 20 or something like that, it's going to be a little different. So you add your modifiers onto the 20 and you see how many by fives you beat the armor class by. If you beat it by 2 steps, then that's another +2 damage on top of the +2 for the critical, even crazier. So every 5 you exceed the armor class by still applies, and and you get that extra bonus damage, plus the +2 from the critical strike, and a bonus effect. Whenever a character gets a critical strike, they can choose to add an additional effect onto that critical strike. They can knock the target back, they can knock it prone, they can give it disadvantage on its next attack, or they can apply the bleeding condition. The player gets to choose what type of extra effect they add onto it, and then describe their amazing critical hit that staggers the enemy backwards. And there's a really cool system that I've embedded into DC20 RPG on how hits are codified and how you say them. What I mean by that is, let's say that 15 armor class again. If you roll below that, that is a miss. If you roll a 15 or higher, that is a hit. But if you exceed the armor class by 5, that is a heavy hit. Heavy hits deal an additional 1 damage. If you roll 10 higher than an armor class, beating it by 5 twice, so beating it by 10 is called a brutal hit. And here's a picture of the character sheet. On a character sheet, there is an armor class, a heavy hit armor class, and a brutal hit armor class. So it's all very quick and streamlined. So if I am attacking a player and the player has an armor class of 12, which means beating it by 5 would be 17 and beating it by 10 would be a 22. So the player can clearly see what their armor class range is across the board. And if I say I have an 18 to hit, an 18 to hit would be a heavy hit. It's quick and clean verbally across the table, and I now know if my monster's base damage is 2, I add 1 to it for a total of 3 damage. And what's really cool is certain monsters or certain player characters, certain class features can add extra stuff onto specifically heavy hits and brutal hits. So right now in DC20, orcs have a +1 damage to all brutal hits that they do. And in DC20, the armor system has damage reduction in it, but the damage reduction only applies to hits. And if you get heavy hit or brutal hit or even more than that, the armor reduction doesn't apply because it bypassed your armor. But now I've said too much. That is the damage system in an overview in DC20 RPG. I am super excited about it. It's one of my favorite parts of the system that I've seen. And after playtesting at GaryCon, it is very quick, very exciting. And one of the people that playtested said, I really thought I was going to miss rolling for damage, but there's so much dynamicness to the attacks. And yes, you have a base damage of your weapon, but how high that attack roll is changes every single swing. What you're pumping into it with your action economy, with your resources, with your class features changes so much that you never really make the same attack twice, and your attack damage directly compares to what you put into it. So if any of this sounds interesting, love the video up, share it around with your friends, spread the love and interest of DC20 RPG. I got a bunch more videos coming about the armor system, magic system, and a whole lot more. And if you want to see all that stuff super early access, you can check out the link down in the description to my Patreon. That is the driving force of what helps support this thing into existence, and you can see all the extra news in advance. So until next time, stay creative, think outside that box. Peace.